What is art? By Leo Tolstoy, Chapter 6. But how could it happen that the very art which in ancient times was either barely tolerated or rejected outright has come in our day to be counted always good, provided only that it gives pleasure? It happened for the following reasons. The worth of art, that is, the worth of the feelings it carries, is judged by how people understand the meaning of life, by what they take to be the good and the evil of life. And the good and the evil of life are defined by what we call religions. Mankind moves without ceasing from a lower, narrower, dimmer understanding of life towards a higher, broader, clearer one. And in this movement, as in every movement, there are those who go in front. There are people who understand the meaning of life more clearly than the rest, and among all these foremost people, there is always one who has expressed that meaning more vividly, more plainly, more powerfully than the others, in his words and in his life. What such a man expresses of the meaning of life, together with the traditions and the rites that usually gather round his memory, is what we call a religion. Religions are signposts. They point to the highest understanding of life available at a given time, in a given society, to the best and most advanced people, and towards that understanding, all the rest of that society is drawn, inevitably and without fail. That is why religions alone have always served, and still serve, as the ground on which men's feelings are judged. If feelings bring people nearer to the ideal the religion points to, if they agree with it and do not contradict it, they are good. If they carry people away from it, if they disagree with it and contradict it, they are bad. Suppose a religion places the meaning of life in the worship of one God and in doing what is taken to be his will, as it was among the Jews. Then the feelings that flow from love of that God and of his law, when art carries them, are good and lofty art, the sacred poetry of the prophets, the Psalms, the story told in the book of Genesis, and everything opposed to this, art that carries the worship of strange gods or feelings at odds with the law of God, will be counted bad art. Suppose a religion places the meaning of life in earthly happiness, in beauty, and in strength, then the joy and the vigor of life carried by art will be counted good art, and art that carries feelings of softness or of gloom will be bad art. So the Greeks judged it. Suppose the meaning of life lies in the good of one's own people, or in carrying on the life the ancestors led, and in honoring them, then art that carries the joy of sacrificing one's own good for the good of the people, or for the glory of the ancestors, and the keeping of their traditions will be counted good art, and art expressing the contrary feelings will be counted bad. So the Romans judged it, and the Chinese. Suppose the meaning of life lies in freeing oneself from the bonds of the animal, then art that carries the feelings which raise the soul and humble the flesh will be good art, as the Buddhists hold, and everything that carries feelings which strengthen the passions of the body will be bad art. Always, in every age and in every human society, there is a religious sense of what is good and what is bad, shared by all the people of that society. And it is this religious sense that decides the worth of the feelings art carries. So among every people, art that carried the feelings flowing from the religious sense common to that people was held good and was encouraged. Art that carried feelings at odds with that religious sense was held bad and was rejected. And all the rest of the vast field of art, through which people commune with one another, was not judged at all. It was rejected only when it ran against the religious sense of its own time. So it was among all peoples, the Greeks, the Jews, the Indians, the Egyptians, the Chinese, and so it was when Christianity appeared. Christianity in its earliest days counted as good works of art only the legends, the lives of the saints, the sermons, the prayers and the hymns which roused in people a love for Christ, a tenderness before his life, a wish to follow his example, a turning away from worldly life, humility and love of others. It counted as bad every work that carried feelings of personal enjoyment, and so it rejected the whole plastic art of the pagans, allowing images in stone and paint only where they were symbols. So it was among the Christians of the first centuries, who took Christ's teaching in a form that was perhaps not wholly true, yet was still not twisted, not made pagan, as it was taken later. But besides these Christians, there appeared another Christianity, closer to paganism than to the teaching of Christ, the Christianity of the Church. It appeared from the time when whole peoples were converted wholesale, by order of the authorities, as under Constantine, under Charlemagne, under Vladimir. And this church Christianity, on the ground of its own teaching, judged the feelings of people and the works of art that carried them in quite another way. Church Christianity did not acknowledge the basic and essential positions of true Christianity, the direct relation of every man to the Father, and the brotherhood and equality of all men that follow from it, and therefore the replacing of every kind of violence by humility and love. It did the very opposite. It set up a heavenly hierarchy on the pattern of pagan mythology, and it bowed down before that hierarchy, before Christ, before the Mother of God, the angels, the apostles, the saints, the martyrs, and not only before these deities but before their images as well. And it made blind faith in the church and in the decrees of the church the very substance of its teaching. Foreign as this teaching was to true Christianity, low as it stood, not only beside true Christianity, but beside the outlook of Romans such as Julian, it was still, for the barbarians who took it up, a higher teaching than their old worship of gods, of heroes, of good and evil spirits. And so this teaching was a religion for those barbarians who took it up, and it was on the ground of this religion that the art of that time was judged. Art that carried a devout reverence for the Mother of God, for Jesus, for the saints and the angels, a blind faith in the church and submission to it, a fear of torment and a hope of bliss beyond the grave, was counted good. All art opposed to this was counted bad. The teaching out of which this art grew was a twisted form of Christ's teaching. Yet the art that grew out of that twisted teaching was real art all the same, because it answered to the religious outlook of the people among whom it arose. The artists of the Middle Ages lived on the same ground of feeling, the same religion, as the mass of the people. They carried the feelings and the moods they knew into architecture, sculpture, painting, music, poetry, and drama. They were true artists. Their work rested on the highest understanding open to their time and shared by the whole people. It was low art by the measure of our own day, but it was true art, and it belonged to the whole people. And so it remained until doubt arose, in the upper, rich, more educated classes of European society, about the truth of that understanding of life which Church Christianity expressed. After the Crusades, after the power of the popes had reached its height and been abused, after men had grown acquainted with the wisdom of the ancients, the people of the rich classes saw two things. On the one hand, they saw the reasonable clarity of the ancient sages. On the other, they saw how little the teaching of the church answered to the teaching of Christ. And then these upper rich classes lost the power to believe in the teaching of the church as they had believed before. Outwardly, they still held to the forms of the church's teaching, but they could no longer believe in it. They held to it only by inertia, and for the sake of the common people, who went on believing blindly in the teaching of the church, and whom the upper classes, for their own advantage, found it necessary to keep in that belief. So there came a time when the teaching of church Christianity ceased to be the common religious teaching of the whole Christian people. The upper classes, the very people in whose hands lay power and wealth, and therefore the leisure and the means to make art and to reward it, stopped believing in the religious teaching of the church. The common people went on believing in it blindly. In their relation to religion, the upper classes of the Middle Ages found themselves where the educated Romans had stood before Christianity appeared. They no longer believed what the people believed, and they had no faith of their own to put in the place of the church teaching, which had outlived itself and lost its meaning for them. There was only this difference. The Romans had lost faith in their emperor gods and their household gods, and nothing more could be drawn from the whole tangled mythology they had borrowed from every conquered nation. They had to take up an entirely new view of the world. But the men of the Middle Ages, once they began to doubt the truths of the Catholic Church's teaching, had no need to look for a new teaching. That Christian teaching which they professed in a twisted form, as the faith of the Catholic Church, had already marked out the road for mankind so far ahead that they had only to throw off the distortions which darkened the teaching Christ revealed, and to take that teaching in. If not in the whole of its meaning, then at least in some small part of it, and a larger part than the church had taken in. And this is just what was partly done, not only by the Reformation of Wycliffe, of Huss, of Luther, of Calvin, but by the whole current of non-church Christianity, whose representatives from the earliest times were the Paulicians and the Bogomils, and later the Waldenses and all the other non-church Christians, the so-called sectarians. But it was the poor who could do this, and did it, those who held no power. Only a few among the rich and the strong, like Francis of Assisi and others, took the Christian teaching in its full living meaning, though that teaching pulled down the comfortable position they held. Most of the upper classes had already lost, in the depths of their souls, their faith in the teaching of the church. Yet they could not or would not do the same. For the heart of the Christian view of the world, which they would have had to take up once they gave up the faith of the church, was the teaching of the brotherhood of men, and therefore of their equality. And such a teaching denied the very privileges they lived by, the privileges in which they had grown up, in which they had been raised, and to which they were accustomed. In the depths of their souls, they did not believe the teaching of the church, which had outlived its age, and no longer held any true meaning for them. And they had not the strength to accept true Christianity. So these rich and ruling people, the popes, the kings, the dukes, and all the great ones of the earth, were left without any religion at all, with nothing but the outward forms of one, which they kept up because they found it not merely useful, but necessary, since that teaching justified the privileges they enjoyed. In substance, these people believed in nothing, just as the educated Romans of the first centuries believed in nothing, and yet power and wealth lay in their hands, and it was these people who rewarded art and directed it, and it was among these people that an art began to grow which was judged no longer by how far it expressed the feelings that flow from the religious sense of men, but only by how beautiful it was. In other words, by how much pleasure it gave. They could no longer believe in the religion of the church, which had shown up its own falsehood. They could not accept the true Christian teaching, which condemned their whole way of life. So these rich and ruling people, left without any religious understanding of life, went back, without meaning to that pagan view of the world which places the meaning of life in the pleasure of the individual. And there came about, among the upper classes, what is called the rebirth of the sciences and the arts. In substance, it was nothing but a denial of all religion, and more than that, an admission that religion is not needed at all. The teaching of the Church, and the Catholic teaching above all, is so tightly knit a system that you cannot change it or correct it without pulling the whole of it down. Once doubt arose about the infallibility of the popes, and by that time it had arisen in every educated mind. Doubt about the truth of Catholic tradition followed of necessity. And doubt about the truth of tradition destroyed not only the papacy and Catholicism, but the whole faith of the Church, with all its dogmas, the divinity of Christ, the resurrection, the Trinity. It destroyed the authority of Scripture, since Scripture was held sacred only because tradition had so decided. So most of the upper classes of that time, the popes and the clergy included, believed in substance in nothing. They did not believe in the teaching of the Church, because they saw that it would not hold, and they could not acknowledge the moral and social teaching of Christ, as Francis of Assisi acknowledged it, and Chelchitsky, and most of the sectarians, because such a teaching pulled down their standing in society. So these people were left without any religious view of the world. And having no religious view of the world, they could have no other measure for judging good art and bad art than personal pleasure. And once they had taken pleasure, that is beauty, as their measure of the good, the upper classes of European society went back, in their understanding of art, to the crude understanding of the primitive Greeks, which Plato had already condemned, and a theory of art was framed among them to match that understanding.